Welcome to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. This is episode 11. I am Jason Compton. Just a couple of notes before we jump into our interview with Ron Martinez. If you've been with The Retro Adventurers from the beginning, thank you very much for being with us. It's been about a year since we started planning this podcast, and I, at least, am very much looking forward to bringing you a lot more episodes, both on games and interviews with classic designers in 2025. If you are joining us from This Week in Retro, which gave us another nice mention this week, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you'll subscribe and stick around. And thank you to the This Week in Retro team for introducing us to you. I was really pleased to get Ron Martinez on the program as a gamebook author, as the author of the Rendezvous with Rama game, as the designer and coder behind Star Trek: The Promethean Prophecy. He definitely made an impact on the 80s text adventure scene and has had an interesting and varied career since then. So I'd like to take you to that interview with Ron right now. Welcome to The Retro Adventurers. I'm Jason Compton, joined on this episode by Ron Martinez, a developer of interactive fiction going back 40 years now. And for those of you scoring at home, this is a Blue Sky success story. Ron, you had posted on the Interactive Fiction Forum a little while ago, sort of inviting people to reach out to you. And I wasn't quite able to make the connection there, but once we set up a Blue Sky account for Retro Adventurers, I said, you know what, I'm going to see who's out there. And I was able to get your attention there, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And yeah, and thanks, Blue Sky.
Yeah, we had not set up a microblogging account before, but as the Blue Sky momentum was building, and it did seem like a lot of game developers and interactive fiction developers in particular were heading there. It seemed like the right time, and already reaping results. So yes, you can follow us now on Blue Sky as well as Facebook. But wanted to talk about Ron, your career, which begins in the comics world, goes through choice books, and then ends up kind of at the leading edge of AI-driven storytelling now with headcanon. Do you want to start by kind of giving us a picture of where you are today with headcanon and what you're doing in the growth of the industry now before we rewind to the 80s?
Sure. I guess over 2 years ago, I started noticing generative AI and its capabilities, and frankly, I was bowled over by it. I thought it was remarkable. Having done the block and tackle work of natural language processing and trying to map that into meaning in interactive fiction systems, it was remarkable how much of this semantic mapping was already done. First, I started with imagery. I worked with some guys in Los Angeles who wanted to create stories around, that was about 3 years ago, create stories around NFT properties. So we did some development there. And then I bid them adieu. And I started building InventionArts.ai. And the primary focus for me is and has been in building characters who are believable, that have a context, that have a raison d'etre, a reason for being, and that behave in believable ways and talk in believable ways, and then putting them into situations where they could take actions or interact with you within the context of some kind of situation, what I call either an episode or an experience, going way beyond the chatbots. And then I thought, well, let me build it out as a platform so that anyone can build. And I'm going to focus on Invention Arts. We have a commercial version of this called Personify, which is at personify.network, which is doing some fascinating work. And it's more commercial, learning, marketing, just another whole sort of application vertical for personas that are, richly realized and have specialized knowledge about whatever their topic is. So Invention Arts decided to build it out as a platform with creator tools so that people can go in and create their personas and their episodes and so on, as opposed to, building it out as something that I use to tell stories. And I started that about 2 years ago. And it just did not push it really from a marketing perspective. I just decided to go as deep as possible in kind of revealing and surfacing the power inherent of an LLM-driven storytelling and persona model. And now we're at the point where, we're several generations in effect of the original, past the original idea. So now we're getting people jumping on board. It's been a wonderful ride. I just love working with it, and it uses imagery, and now we have real-time conversations that feel like you're talking to somebody on the phone. You're talking to a character directly without pressing buttons. They know what's going on. They come from specific worlds. We introduced a model called open world. And open world is a kind of approach to intellectual property that says that anyone can stand up an open world, which is licensed Creative Commons CC 4.0 by. And so anything that you create within that open world, you're free to exploit or render or create any kind of derivative work, commercial or not. So at this point, we're starting to build those open worlds, and we've got a few of them that are beginning to come online, and anybody can just create a character in an open world, like a Hieronymus Bosch world, the Garden of Earthly Delights, and we're creating new creatures and characters that are in that you can talk to they sometimes just knock your socks off. We have an Aztec futurist world called Zolotlan, which is similar in some ways to the Black Panther, in a sense that, this is an Aztec city that was lost for 1,000 years, but developed its own technology, its own philosophy, its own way of governing, and has now emerged in contemporary times with these heroic Aztec heroes, really, who are intent on preserving the indigenous culture, but also avenging the wrongs that have been visited upon indigenous peoples. It's like a world, like a universe, like a Marvel universe.
Yeah.
Well, these are AI, they're rooted in AI, the creation of them. And then you can create a persona, create a situation, put these characters together, talk to them within that world with consistent look and feel, consistent styling and graphics and so on, which is kind of enforced by the open world. And we'll just see where it goes. It's freeing to not think about, do I need to go license something? And also, I don't want to, some people are building things and, they'll have Star Trek characters and so on and so forth. And I ran intellectual property innovation at a large internet company, Yahoo, for a number of years. And you just can't do that. You can do it, and but you can't get away with everything as fan fiction. So let's, just sidestep that and build our own worlds. So that's where Invention Arts is right now. And anybody can go there and sign up, and if they come through this route somehow, we'll give them a code or something so that they don't have to pay as much as other people do.
Okay. All right. Well, several technology generations before that, you were a young man with an Atari 800, with some exposure to the interactive fiction of the day. I'd like to just hear a little bit about how you first got into the world. I believe your first text adventure was Rendezvous with Rama, one of the Trillium Telarium titles, correct?
That's correct.
I'm just interested to hear how you went from the choice book world, which at the time was in quite a boom, to then becoming a pioneering interactive fiction writer.
Well, there was a guy who was who really deserves his own spotlight, named Byron Price, Preiss. And I met him. I was doing comics with my with a couple of partners. One was Joel and Trilling. We did heavy metal comic strips, strips in various heavy metal issues. And I had a Playboy Funnies monthly column with a French illustrator, a guy named Jacques Roch-Berny, who I just happened to meet. I got a whole backstory about real estate gangsterism and nightclubs and stuff like that, but maybe we can talk about that another time. But anyway, so I met Jacques. He invited me to write with him, and through those credits and that work surfacing, somebody connected me up with Byron, and Byron was a book packager and very forward-looking, and he saw Choose Your Own Adventure working well, and he said, well, let's build other, he could recognize. And I always like this, you can look at the instance of something, a choose your own adventure, but he was able to look at it as a story system, as a medium, in effect, with its own characteristics, so that could be applied to other forms of content. So he launched a time machine series, and what you were doing is jumping around in time. And then he wanted to build a series that was like what he called a video game in your pocket. and that was Be an Interplanetary Spy, which is kind of funny. And so he invited me to write one. I ended up writing two of them. They were fun, you know. It was the first time I had worked with nonlinear storytelling. And what struck me about it, as somebody in the serious writing, the serious fiction writing that I was doing, somebody who was interested in experimental fiction, zero-degree writing, writing which had no subject or narrative, but was about the words, Roland Barthes, and, you know, sort of highfalutin experimental approaches to narrative. That here was this simple, you know, it was like a toy, but the act of putting the reader into the role of protagonist changed everything, right? So it was the vocative form. So this, to me, was more radical and more interesting than any of the experimental fiction that I had seen coming out of the academies or whatever. So I got really taken by it. I wrote a couple of those, and then I was good at it. And so he then wanted to launch a graphic adventure, and he had secured the rights. He'd worked with a lot of science fiction writers. He secured the rights to Rendezvous with Rama. So he said, "Would you like to write this?" And I said, "Sure." You know, I was a science fiction kid, just reading science fiction, you know, Galaxy and, you know, all of those Isaac Asimovs.
Sure.
I did meet Asimov later. I can tell you a funny story about that. But anyway, so I signed up to do that. They gave me the book, and I had to tear it down effectively to figure out and look at it as almost a simulation of reality, right? It was, you know, one thing that was very helpful to me was Vladimir Nabokov, the author of Lolita, among other things.
Which was not developed into a game by Telarium or Trillium, as I recall.
It was
Although that,
not developed into a game. But he did these lectures on literature. I think it was at Princeton, but so I read this book about that he of his transcripts of his lectures, and he talked about constructing fiction, and it was really the approach was simulation. So he knew where things were at what time. He knew he kind of decomposed the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and he could map out where the door was, what time this person was walking by. And I realized this thing was a simulation. The approach, some of these great novels are, you know, they were simulations, and you were seeing, you had a point of view that was at certain points in time and space within this living world.
okay.
So I took that as an approach. Regrettably, in some ways, Rendezvous with Rama was hindered by an extremely primitive system that was built by a couple of guys who were, you know, really smart and everything, but it was a very simple verb noun, you know, look, door, shoot, gun, take artifact, that kind of thing. And, you know, so it was limiting, but nonetheless, it was fun. And I did get to get on the phone with Arthur C. Clarke and talk to him about how I was approaching it. And that was pretty great.
Yeah, that sort of puts you, you know, in the position of you know, being the next Kubrick, I guess, if you get to adapt the Clark property to the, you know, to the screen at the time.
Well, you know, I think is it Denis Villeneuve who did the directed the Dune
Mm-hmm.
movie.
Yeah.
I think I've been reading that his next property is Rendezvous with Rama.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now that was a project that you were brought into as the writer, as the designer. You said, you know, other people developed the system. So were you
Yeah.
working in those development tools, you know, whatever their language was, or were you, you know, sort of handing over flat files and they were being implemented by others?
No, I was working with their tools. I had to enter things into fields and, you know, press buttons and say, you know, what were the consequences of this action? And then, you know, so I was working with their system.
Okay. And
Um,
were you, you know, in contact at all with, you know, because there were the other games in that series at that time, Amazon, Nine Princes and Amber, you know, and so forth. Was there collaboration between the teams working on those, or were you pretty much off in your
nope,
own world?
they're pretty much in our own world. I think we were the first one of them.
Okay.
Um, so I'm not sure. Actually, I don't really remember if they were running in parallel. I don't think they were. They may have been, but we didn't really communicate. I'm still in touch with some of the, you know, a couple of the artists from back then, but there was a fellow named Lebbeus Woods, who was a brilliant visionary architect, and he was very inspiring, and he did the cover and the interior. And also a fold-out map, which you can find online. He passed away recently, but look up Lebbeus Woods and be amazed. So it was great working with him as well.
Now, in your interview with Jason Scott for Get Lamp, which we'll link to in this show, you sort of very casually frame it as, well, I decided to develop my own system, so I learned Forth and I went off and wrote a new parser-based system, which sounds very simple. Can you tell a little bit about how you go from being a writer who obviously has a lot of thoughts about storytelling and the craft to just saying like, oh sure, I'll just sit down and bang out a parser system that's more or less on par with what Infocom's doing, or even exceeding it in some ways.
Right. Yeah, it was. I saw a cartoon recently. We didn't do this because it was easy. We did it because we didn't realize it was not easy.
Yeah.
I forget where I saw that, but well, I am self-taught in everything. I'm a self-educated person. I was working since I was 14. My father picked cotton in the fields in Texas, and he always told me there's a trick to everything. You just have to figure it out. So I had that, crazy confidence that if something is doable, I may not know how to do it now, but I can figure it out. And so with that, I dove into it, read books about programming. One of the guys, blanking on his name right now, but he's the one who recommended Forth to me. And Forth sounded really interesting because what you do with Forth is you build a language and then you build your application in the language you created. For that reason, it's also sometimes referred to as the write-only language because nobody can read it after you've written it except you. And it turned out to be really helpful. And I got very far with it, actually, in building this. And it was really just reading books and, it's like trying to puzzle out, how do I get this? How do I type a sentence in that's, give Spock the phaser and ask him about the alien ambassador. How do you a richer sentence than, drop gun? And I came across something called augmented transition networks, and then adapted them. And what they do is they were sort of the key to the parser side of things, because what they do is they set up in some ways similar to the predictive nature of LLMs, large language models of like ChatGPT, but in a very, very primitive, very, very small scale way. They were basically semantic networks of words that could follow other words. So when you said, Spock, take, the next thing is either an article or a noun. And then the next thing after that can only be an end to the sentence, or it can be, the word and, or, some kind of a connective tissue to another clause. Same thing with prepositions, put this in that. So when you had one word, there were only several other kinds of words that could follow it. So then I would have a lookup table of words that were characterized by the part of speech. And then I would see if any of those routed out to something meaningful. And so once I cracked the code on that, I was quite happy. And then the next part was building the world. Because going back to this Nabokov notion, the world itself in any of these, if it works well enough, and hopefully I built it, but the people who used it, were able to express that. We needed to figure out, okay, what are these entities that are in this world? So there was, there were things, right? There was an object, and then an object could be a container. An object could be also mobile. So you can put something inside of something. And it was really fun. I remember once I had a red box. I said, open the red box, open the red box. I said, put the red box in the red box. And it said, look in the red box. It said, in the red box, there's a red box. In the red box, there's a red box. And it just was my first experience with recursion. And in this world, then, this idea of objects, it was really a simulation. I was, modeling these objects. And in those worlds, characters were mobile talking containers.
Okay.
Right? Because you could give them things,
Yep.
and they had them. You'd express a little bit different, and they could talk. You could talk to them, and they were mobile. They could move from point A to point B. So anyway, long story short, ended up with a world model and a way to talk to that world. And from there, I showed it to Mark Blank had actually left. He was one of the honchos at Infocom, had left Infocom and had been recruited to Simon and Schuster to run interactive fiction projects. And there was a fellow who was a publisher there, Joe Esposito. So Mark also had a woman named Deborah Weinberger, who became the producer for Simon and Schuster, still a friend. They saw what it could do, and they said, well, how about doing a Star Trek title? I said, sure. So that's how we did Promethean Prophecy, which was an original story. And I had a writing partner at the time, Jim Gasparini. And Gasparini had written a couple of Time Machine books for Byron. So that's how I knew him.
Okay.
So he and I collaborated on the story and then just built the scenario out and all the interactivity and functionality and branches and so on. And we were trying not to just be branching stories. We were trying to really leverage that simulation model. So, it turned out pretty well. We were very happy with it.
So you've developed the system and you're essentially shopping it around for, where, what would you, the publishers, like us to write and deliver to you in the system. Transfiction system was the title, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of rooted in transfix was the idea. Transfiction.
Okay. And yeah, I did not know until that Get Lamp interview that you pointed me to. I had heard the story that Simon and Schuster was trying to acquire Infocom. I had no idea that there had been a talent transfer as well. So that was fascinating.
Yeah.
And that Star Trek license at Simon and Schuster, I am really fascinated about, and I need to take some more time on this podcast to cover it because Promethean Prophecy was the second, adventure game released under that license. The first being the Kobayashi Alternative, which you said you really didn't have much exposure to before you started working on Promethean Prophecy. Do you know where it was, sort of in the pipeline at the time?
Not really. To tell you the truth, I didn't pay much attention to it. I was kind of maniacally focused on what I was doing. In some ways, I didn't want to know, but and right now I forget. I think I did take a look at it at some point, but I took a look at a few things. But
yeah, because that is, that's a game, and we see this, even in the other titles that we've covered, even by, 83, 84, 85, you can see that some companies are saying, well, all right, maybe we've done this system. We've done the two-word parser. We've done the Infocom, kind of Zorkian, adventures. Let's try something different. Kobayashi Alternative, proceeds from the premise of let's make the text parser be things that you are speaking. We will do all of the moving and the taking and the using and the shooting. We'll do that through function keys or other commands. But if you type it, it's something that you are saying, which sounds great and in practice was not. So I'm interested in hearing, from your reflections, because it sounds like you were already immersed in that world. You had worked in the system that you were using at Telarium for Rendezvous with Rama. What made you say, let's stay on the regular sentence parser world. Well, let's just do it better rather than try to spin something new around it.
well, because I had seen that. First of all, I was a big admirer of the Infocom and Moretsky and all those characters and what they had accomplished, and thought that there was really a lot of life in that model. There's also something about the freedom of creating within a text universe, which is something expressed as text, which is remarkably productive. You're free to describe things, and you're not stuck with imagery or an overly opinionated user interface or internal system. You can say that the admiral showed up and burst into flames, and it happened. So that's kind of where we're at. Although I should say that the next title I did on Star Trek for Simon Schuster, not to jump the gun, I did experiment with a different kind of system altogether, based on something I built in between.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about that progression. For Promethean Prophecy, the story infamously about the Wrath of Khan is that director Nicholas Meyer sat down, watched all the Star Trek episodes, and said, "Okay, this Khan guy, this is something we need to hear a little bit more about."
Mhm.
Promethean Prophecy does have callbacks to the episode Balance of Terror. Did you go through a similar process, or were you already a Star Trek guy and that was a favorite? Sort of what did you do in terms of developing, okay, how are we going to tell a Star Trek story with some callbacks as well as with some some original concepts?
Well, I was a Star Trek guy, and I had seen all the episodes when they were first aired on television.
Mhm.
You know, so very much interested in that world. I thought about it a lot. I thought about the bridge as being, the crew is sort of like I think somebody made this observation that each of the characters was like an aspect of a single mind,
Mm.
right? McCoy was kind of like the emotional aspect and empathetic aspect of the mind. Spock, of course, the cerebral thinking part. The protagonist, the actor, of course, is Kirk making those decisions. You have communication and Uhura, and the body in some ways is, Scotty, and Sulu to some extent. Those, it just seemed, and it still seems to be a very remarkably designed world and set of characters if you want to explore what it's like and to allow yourself, as I allowed myself to project myself into those worlds and those situations. I think that's what was great about Star Trek and what we wanted to do in the interactive fiction. A great film or television show, you don't watch it, you live it, right? You feel like you've experienced it because there are places where you can inject your identity and into those worlds. You're not just a passive observer. You really feel that you are Kirk or you whoever you are. So anyway, it seemed like there was like a great one-to-one mapping there when we said explicitly, yes, you are Kirk or you are whomever.
You talked a little bit in Get Lamp about how there wasn't a whole lot of supervision over the type of storytelling you were doing in the Star Trek universe. So was it pretty much we'll ship it to you and you let us know if there's a problem? It sounds like they were not asking for like a flat episodic treatment or something like that.
No, we had a lot of freedom to just build whatever we wanted. And there were property police. Paramount had to make sure that we didn't introduce new canon or something that conflicted with canon, and that the characters were aligned with the character definitions of the series, because there's a series Bible.
Yeah.
So we did have access, I believe, to the series Bible. I wish I had it. I don't know what happened to it. But the series Bible kind of laid out who the characters were and what the dynamics were. But aside from that, I think I might have said this in that interview. I don't think people really knew what the hell we were doing. It's like how do you manage something you don't truly understand? Although I'd say Deb Weinberger was very astute and she figured out a lot about how it worked. And she really helped keep she deserves a lot of credit for keeping the project on track.
And Star Trek is just such an interesting story in many ways, kind of being the epicenter of the growth of what we now call fan culture, and the
Mm,
fact that Paramount in the 70s was so hands off about it. You get that whole, I don't know how much you were into Star Trek fandom at the time, but through the kind of hands off attitude they took towards the release of that Starfleet technical manual in the
mm,
70s, there's now this kind of side universe, and I guess it did eventually get brought under our licensing umbrella, but for a long time, there was
mhm,
this whole world floating around that because they were so hands off about that book, you could have, a lot of things that were described in the original series that were in this sort of weird gray area. So
mhm,
interesting that by the mid 80s, as the films are going, as they're spinning up the new series, they were paying a little bit more attention.
mhm.
So yeah, from Promethean Prophecy, it looks like you were working on some other projects and working with EA. And I really, as we're putting all of this together, I had not heard the story about the William S. Burroughs property that you were
Mhm.
working on. EA at that time, as I was pointing out, they were publishing Thomas Dish's Amnesia, which is a very adult oriented type
Mhm.
of story from a very adult oriented author. You pointed out that's around the time they were working with Timothy Leary. What were they doing over there that was
Mhm.
taking them in directions that yes, in some ways we saw pan out, but it seems like they could have gone even further to the edge. And then of course we see they kind of became a big franchise and sports publisher. But wow, EA in
Mhm.
the later part of the 80s was really looking to break some molds, it sounds.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say, what were they smoking?
Well, don't want to cast aspersions or do any
No, they weren't
unpaid
edible.
advertising for any products, but
Well, before I jump into that, I should point out that Jim and I, the guy I work with, Promethean Prophecy on, Jim had this idea. His brother was a journalist working in Central America, and he had this idea of doing a political simulation to model a post-revolutionary Central American, fictional post-revolutionary Central American country called Chimerica, like a chimera, Chimera. And with a body of El Salvador and claws of Haiti, a head of Cuba. And you, in this simulation, you would play the role of the president who takes power after the fall of this unpopular dictator who ran the country into the ground named Farsante. And you play for 3 years in game time. And you don't win or lose. You state what your goals are at the outset, and then we constructed an entry in the Encyclopedia Chimerica, which described the successes and failures of your administration. That was a very different approach where you were talking to characters, and those characters represented certain interests, and you were making decisions, and you had advisors who would come in and you would appoint them from different political parties. And so their political perspectives changed what your options were because you had a far right interior minister that would only offer you far right options. If you had a leftist, you'd have other options. So that turned out to be a really groundbreaking program. Was used by the State Department's Foreign Service Institute in Virginia. They invited us down. They were using it to train FBI, CIA, and DEA agents in Latin American politics. The African National Congress used it to model post-apartheid South Africa. And I adapted that into something called the Transinium Challenge, which was on the same model, where your advisors were now, it was for Star Trek Next Generation. So you'd have Worf and, Mr. Data and so on. So that was another Star Trek title. So that was kind of a bridge there. And I built that on top the hidden agenda model.
and that was very clever of you to work in your own transfiction branding into the title of the game. How'd you work that out? Yeah,
Transinium.
can't be a
Nobody,
coincidence.
no, it's transfiction and
Yeah.
transinium. Yeah, I made a massively multiplayer game with Sega, one of the first million player games called 10-6 later on, and you were collecting this stuff called Transium. You know, so I forget how I hooked up with EA. I'd say there were adventurous producers there. They were trying to figure out. I mean, there came, the Trip had and his team, Trip Hawkins and his
Yeah.
team. They were focused on being a publisher. I posted recently somewhere that, before EA, games were like sold in plastic bags, which is not quite true because, my own games were sold that way. And Steve Moretsky, who's the friend on Facebook, said, Infocom,
Yeah.
the beautiful packaging. But they really saw it as, finding authors in effect and then publishing them. And then they decided that they really needed to prime the pump. There wasn't, enough out there that would move the medium forward, happening naturally on its own, and they felt they really needed to kind of lead and push the medium forward. Trip their ad famously was, "Can a computer make you cry? Right? Can it evoke the emotion of a film or a book?" So that's what they were trying to do. Now there was a producer named Stuart Bonn, Bonn, And he became my producer, and he was very adventurous. He still is an adventurous guy living out in California. We see him every now and then. So somehow, I forget how I got introduced to the EA people. Stuart called me up and said, "Well, do you ever go to a murder party? I want to do that with software." So this was like the most computer game, because what you do is put in 6 or 8 friends, which may have, hindered the product in the marketplace because people who would buy an EA game and sit with their Atari 800 didn't have 6 friends. Right?
Right.
So you put in those names, and then you put in a date, and it would print invitations and would also print out scripts for them. So it built a kind of generative murder mystery, which created and it's like with all of these, you have to figure out what is the root of this story system, this narrative model. How does it work? Well, murder mystery, there's 3 things you need to know. You need motive, means, and opportunity. So I said, okay, so what I'll do is create a bunch of characters. Each time we generate a story, I'll give them all motive, means, and opportunity. And then one by one, I'll take one of those 3 things away from each of them, except for one of them. That's your killer. And then generate scripts based upon those variables, those story variables. And there was a woman named Robin Platt, and I got her to write another one, and she was great, very good writer, kind of a soap opera story. So we built that, and that was a lot of fun. And then, pursued other projects, and that's when, but in New York, actually, Tom Dish was a friend. We had a circle of people making interactive fiction, and I was in New York City at the time. I'm originally from the Bronx and lived in Manhattan, and Tom was in New York. And of course, I'd read his science fiction stuff. He became part of that circle, and I don't know how he hooked up with EA, but Tom had it in his mind to write at least one work in every medium. And so
Okay.
he did pitch Amnesia to them. And, he wrote a children's book, which was The Brave Little Toaster.
I
Uh,
always forget about that.
yeah. So Disney, produced that, as a feature. He wrote an opera, he wrote novels, he wrote all kinds of things. He was just a wonderful guy. One thing that few people know about him is that after The Brave Little Toaster, they asked him to write a treatment, and he came up with a story about a king who was a lion in the jungle,
Mm-hmm.
and he was paid $10,000 for it, and it was sort of modeled on the Lear story, King Lear,
Uh-huh.
work for hire. And of course, this was one of the roots of the Lion King, $1 billion property.
Right.
Tom was sort of brilliant, and he understood the premise was good. Amnesia, you wake up because it's like you're trying to feel your way around in this world, right? So if you have amnesia and you wake up in some world, well, what is that world and who am I in it? It's a great premise. So that's what he did. And then Tim Leary, I don't even know how Tim got involved. And I even forget what he was doing, but it was some kind of psychedelic, title. And Stuart was
Mind
involved in that
Mirror.
as well. What's that?
Mind Mirror was the
Mind
name of
Mirror.
it. Yeah.
Yes. Right. So we got to hang around. Back then, EA had what was the forerunner to the Game Developers Conference. It was just EA developers getting together at the Hotel Dunphy in San Mateo. So a
Mhm.
bunch of us would all get together and give talks and stuff like that. At the end, we'd have the C64 demolition derby, where because we all hated developing for it, so they would put a C64 and everybody got a chance to break it with a bat, smash it.
Really?
Yeah,
As
I
a
know.
C64 fan, I will stand up for it any day of the week,
I
but
know. They're sort of
interesting.
beloved, but if you were developing for it, you were just like, it's driving me crazy, especially the floppy disk with its own brain.
Well, yes, yes. The disk drive was notoriously a problem. I didn't
Yeah.
think the machine itself. But of course, this is the attitude we would expect from an Atari 800 user. So
Right. Yeah. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate from the C64. But I always defended the C64. I should say that, I would stop people from hitting it.
So yeah, to back up, when you were developing transfiction system, what machine or machines was your kind of primary platform for that before it then got ported?
Now, first was the Atari 800,
Okay.
and then I got an IBM PC. I got a PC Junior, and then I got a PC. And they were floppy disk. One of the nice things about Forth was that it's a threaded interpreted language. If you had an interpreter for a different CPU, then you had portable code. So I could write it once and run it on C64 with Forth for C64, IBM, and Atari 800.
And going to Murder Party, definitely heard what you were saying about maybe being a little ahead of its time, but it was part of that. We would see these kind of fits and starts of trying to make the computer the center of a social experience. And at a time
Yeah,
before you've got easy networking. If you have a modem, it's expensive. It's expensive to call around with it. But what can we do to kind of center the computer, even if it's not turned on as part of the Murder Party itself? How can we build
right.
more social experiences around it? So that was an
Yeah.
interesting sidebar there. And then yeah, what did you take from that into as your career continued, where it's like, oh, now we can make things more social because either we can get a room full of computers or a room full of handheld smartphones or easy connectivity or all of these things simultaneously. How did
Mhm.
stuff like Murder Party translate to that work?
Well, networked computers were the sort of obvious path that made a lot of things possible. And I should say that, EA at the time, attempting to kind of, evolve the medium of computer games was very adventurous in those, working with Murder Party, but certainly with Tim Leary and Tom Dish. Well, where I went to create a company called Postlinear Entertainment. So first of all, I got recruited by a guy named Vinod Khosla, who was at Kleiner Perkins. I forget where I met at this point, where I met these people at a party or something like that. And I remember Vinod, he was like one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. He's a huge, hugely influential and well-known now VC, venture capitalist with Khosla Ventures. Oh yeah, I had been recruited to build a sailing simulation by Philips because they were delivering a multimedia box called CDI.
Oh, sure.
So so they uh, contracted my company to build a sailing simulation. And that was sort of the first time I created navigable 3D environments, which were not real-time 3D, but which felt like real-time 3D. You were kind of moving through a series of frames, which, it was like a navigable movie. So I did that, and that's what Vinod saw. By the way, at that point, I had pitched Phillips on doing something I called Mammal Club, which it was a story that I originally pitched to Steve Case when he was doing whatchamacallit,
AOL Quantum Link
yeah,
at the
Quantum
time.
Link,
Yeah.
exactly. And he offered me like $65,000 for us. It's too cheap. Uh, and so anyway, I pitched that to them, and later on, that became 10-6 with Sega and Sega's Heat Network. But in the interim, Vinod asked me, he said, "Well, I'd like to know what your business plan is. I'd like to see it." I said, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's great." And I walked away. I was so clueless. I didn't know what he meant. I thought, who is this nosy guy asking to see my business? What business is it of his? I had no idea, because where I came from in New York, that's not what we did. I had
Hmm.
been recruited, by the way, to run media for Microsoft, and they flew me to Redmond, and I met with all these executives, and you'll be working with Bill and so on. They said, pick a floor in our new building, hire all your friends, write your deal. I couldn't see myself pulling a Microsoft card out of my wallet. I just at that point it just wasn't cool. So when Vinod said, "Well, there's a new platform that Trip is bringing out called 3DO,
Hmm.
and we are financing various companies to be feeders of games to that platform because we need both. And one of them is called Spectrum Holobyte, and it's based out here. Would you be interested in joining that company?" said, well, that sounds interesting. So this was like 91. So actually, I ended up joining it. It was a funny story, though. When I was growing up, reading all the science fiction, I wanted to meet aliens in the worst way. And so I thought, well, so we need to have interstellar travel. I need to be able to get on one of these ships. But then, so I got very interested in rockets and ST's model rockets and reading up on them. And I was the kid who would call up the NASA guy on the radio when he did a guest shot and realized that we would not have faster than light travel in my lifetime. It's
Yeah.
almost not going to happen. So what's the answer? Well, extend your lifetime. So I started looking into immortality and reading about that and came across something called progeros, which is when if you've ever seen it's very tragic, a child ages to like an 80-year-old man or woman and they're 6 years old. It's an actual condition. So well, if a and this is actually going somewhere, but so if it's clear then that aging is a triggered process. So if you could find the metaphorical firing pin and file it down, it would never trigger aging and you could live forever.
Mhm.
So I started looking into that and then, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I gave up, but I did reason that when somebody did figure it out, it wouldn't be in a slushy at the 7-Eleven. This would be something that people who are very wealthy and influential would have, and they keep to themselves, and the rest of us can just die as we always have. Fast forward, I tell these guys, okay, well maybe I'll join your Spectrum Holobyte. Vinod flies me out. I go to Sand Hill Road to their offices, Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield Byers, and go in, and there's the CEO of the company, who is Gilman Louie, who went on to run In-Q-Tel, which was the CIA's venture firm. That's another story. And a guy named Barry James Folsom was the president, and Vinod. And I walked into this office, and I'd never seen anything like this. It was a glassed-in conference room, and people were writing on it, and the three guys were laughing. And so we said hi, and then Gilman says to me, "Do you know what those guys are doing in there?" I said, "I haven't got the slightest idea." He said, "Well, those guys are going to halt the aging process, and Vinod will give them whatever they want. They just ask for money and they get it." I said, "Oh, really?" And Vinod turns to me and he says, "Yes. Have you ever seen the children who age prematurely, like they're 80 when they're 6?" And I said, "Oh, Jesus, these are the guys. This is it." And I said, "Yeah, I know all about that." And they said, "Well, this is what the company does. It's a telomerase." And okay. I said, "All right, guys, I'll take the job, but I want you to give me whatever they're making as a benefit of my employment." And they agreed. And we all shook hands on it. And I joined the company. Later on at a TED conference, after I had left the company, I ran into Vinod, and that company was in the Science Times featured story about their telomerase chain manipulations. And I said, "Hey, your guys are on. Remember, you owe me what they." And he said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "So you supposed to." And he said, "No, Ron, I don't know what you're talking about." And foolish, I didn't put it in writing. And this was at an early TED conference in Monterey, and between sessions, and then we had this sort of group forming around us because it was starting to get heated. He was getting heated, Vinod, and and I kept pressing him, and finally he said, and he was sort of shaking, and he said, "Ron, I never promised you immortality as a benefit of your employment." And I said, "Okay, that'll do. I'll take that." Thank you very much, Vinod. Anyway, so that's Silicon Valley for you. So anyway, I joined over there, and we actually worked on another Star Trek title there, which kind of didn't really see the light of day. It was very confused, building on the Transinium challenge model. And then they shipped something else there, which didn't do well. It just kind of fumbled that one. But I remember Sid Meier, who created Civilization. He was there because he was building stuff, and also the Alexei Pajitnov, who created Tetris. There was some really, great luminaries there. But I pitched, I had this idea, and I pitched it to Sid, something called cuvilization. which was like Civilization, but told from the viewpoint of the character Q, if you remember from
Oh,
Star
yeah,
Trek.
yeah, yeah.
Civilization. And it
Got
got
it.
pretty far, and then somebody shot it down, I think Paramount. And so that's, you were saying, how do we evolve? So did that stuff, did some games there, left, formed Postlinear Entertainment. Stuart Bond created his own company. Came to me and said, "What games do you want to produce?" I said, "Well," he said, "I would like to do a flight sim." I said, "Well, let's do a flying saucer flight sim, rather than just another F-16."
Yeah.
So we made a game called Flying Saucer, which had a sort of rich story. And then actually with that one, I had recruited Phil Tippett. You know who Phil Tippett is?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, probably ring a bell, but he's one of the great special effects masters. He did the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and Starship Troopers and so on and so forth. And I got him and his team, which was based in Berkeley, to do the design for Flying Saucer. But then he had to pull out because he got Starship Troopers, and his
Hmm.
whole team had to do that. So that was kind of sad. Anyway, so we did that, and then at Post Linear, I got really interested in network games. So to go back to your notion of social gaming or your mention of social gaming, if at the end of every node there's a person, well, what the hell does that mean? Right? So this was early 90s. I should say there was one other thing that when I was at Spectrum Holobyte, I had this idea, and it's one of the reasons I left is to kind of pursue it. I had this notion that you could change the nature of gameplay and the experience of games and also the economics of games if you could have ownable digital objects. So that sword is something that you could buy and
Mm-hmm.
own and trade. And it was persistent. It had persistent value, persistent presence in reality. So I started working on that when I left Spectrum Holobyte, and I spent time with the Magic the Gathering guys because I wanted to know who I had met when I was at Spectrum, how is it that this card is worth $100 and this card is worth 2 cents? What is it about the card that gives it that value? And could we do that digitally? And of course, the problem in the digital environment is that even if you had sort of huge demand, if your product is infinitely copyable, it has no value. It's a supply and demand question, or it's
Right.
basics. So how do you create limited edition digital objects? Now this is commonplace, but back then there wasn't anything like it. I I came up with a model and then I hit the wall. And the guy who helped me, there was a fellow named Bill Hurdle, Herdle, who was a chemist at Union Carbide and part of the fourth community. And he was an advisor and actually wrote some of the game code. So I really do have to credit Bill in the original development of, which I neglected to mention earlier, the interactive fiction system and so on, because I don't think I could have done it without him. A brilliant guy. He was a guy who lived alone in upstate New York, and he had fluorescent lights in his living room, and call him up and he'd say, answer Bill Hurdle. He's like, brilliant guy. But anyway, I went to Bill and I said, I'm trying to build these limited edition digital objects, but I'm hitting the wall. There's something called cryptography. I need cryptography here. I know cryptographic proofs. I don't know how to do that. He said, "Oh, well, why don't you call my friend that I play D&D with? He knows about cryptography." So he hooked me up with this guy, Bruce Schneier, Schneier, who turned out to be a god of cryptography. He wrote Applied Cryptography, the Red Book. And he went on to become head of computer security at British Telecom and things like that. A very influential guy. And I used to fly him out, and we'd sit and we'd have these sessions and then go into San Francisco and go eat burritos and stuff like that. And we came up with a model together, which we called Transactor. So another trans. And Transactor did implement limited edition digital objects. I can send you and we patented it. And so that became sort of central to the notion of network games for me. By the way, they are the forerunner of what NFTs are, except that it wasn't on a blockchain. It was on a set of federated servers where you maintain the individual numbered items and individual numbered users and associated them and then transferred them between one another and so on. But I reached back in and I had this idea, the Mammal Club I told you about, and I thought, well, this would be great for Transactor. So the scenario there was kind of inspired by Rendezvous with Rama, which had this large ship sort of come into the solar system, unknown what its purpose was. So I had this idea of a large planetoid coming into your solar system and our solar system. And through some exploratory work, it was revealed that there was, this extremely valuable mineral called transium on it, very powerful. And so there was a mad rush to go mine it. And there were a number of corporations that sponsored Infrastruct, which was kind of like Bechtel Corp, and Toyco, which is like the Hello Kitty world, and a couple of others, Extreme, which was sort of like extreme sports, And so you could join one of these clans effectively. And I had a friend, another game maker, and he said, I'm going to make the first 1,000-player network game. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. And so I went home, I thought about it. I said, yeah, I'm going to make the first 1,000,000-player game. So I said, okay, this is a 1,000,000-player game. And it ended up being called 10-6, which 10 to the sixth is a million.
Mm.
And it was, implemented Transactor, these limited edition digital objects. And it was part of the launch of the Sega Heat Network. And, I have all these clippings with, the Gary Griffiths, the founder, talking about, yes, and it's a whole new economic model where, you can get the game for almost nothing, and then you buy game objects to help mine and defend your claims on this world where you stake out your transium mining operation. Interestingly enough, that game, when they finally shut down Heat Network, there was a development team. We handed it off to Sega to finish it because I got pulled into financial services stuff based on this transactor technology, which is another whole story I won't get into. But the development team that was part of my team at Postlinear in San Francisco, and then blended a bit with the Sega team. They kept the source code and they stood up the game, and it's been running ever since at projectvisitor.com. It's like 20 some, it's the longest running network game ever.
Interesting.
So anyway, that was the idea, this notion that a social experience, you had a crew that you were part of. You would create mutual defense networks. I remember back in the Quantum Link days, Steve Case told me, well, what we were trying to do is get people to buy minutes, right? I said, okay, well, how about what would be a game design that sort of encouraged you or forced you to spend 24 hours a day online? Well, how about if you had something of value online, like in an online world that other people could attack and take apart? Wouldn't you want to always be online?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, yeah. And that's what 10-6 did. And then what flowed from that were things like mutual defense networks. So while I'm sleeping, my friends in Australia could be watching my base and defending it, and vice versa. And so you ended up with this kind of social structures that were emerging around this idea of mining, creating valuable stuff, and then having people attack it and needing to defend it 24 hours a day. Yeah, so it was really the first persistent online universe. It was fun.
Fellow retro adventurer has joined. He's not able to join us on audio, but Dave Hawkins threw into the chat. He said, back in 1981, when I first started programming, friend and I wrote a two-player version of Noughts and Crosses that swapped the moves between the two linked Sinclair ZX81s using the tape load system connections. I guess we should have done more with that.
Great idea.
Yeah. So, we've talked about your kind of evolution as gaming was evolving, and kind of the whole palette of where and when and how games would be consumed would change. What have you been surprised by in terms of the path that interactive games have taken since the late 1980s? In particular, the choice game genre has been a real success on smartphones and tablets since maybe the
Mhm.
mid 2000s. So, as a pioneering choice book developer, writer yourself, did that seem like a long time coming? Was that something that surprised you, or were you like, yes, this actually is the perfect medium for it? Glad we got here.
No, I think more of the latter. It's kind of snackable content, right? And when you have your phone, it's sort of opportunistically you can jump into it. Now you become obsessed with it, of course. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like it makes a lot of sense. It's fairly straightforward. It's not especially demanding, to interact with it and get something happening, which is rewarding. I mentioned Alexei Pajanov, who created Tetris. He talked a lot about game structures and why they worked. He was a Russian psychologist. I'm still not sure if he was looking retrospectively at his own work and then coming up with theories about why Tetris worked, or if he used them as principles to generate Tetris. But one thing in this regard, it strikes me that, he said that you have to understand what the ultimate goal is, but it's not immediately attainable. So there are a whole range of interim steps, and those interim steps should be attainable, which seems like a commonplace notion now, right? Because you're leveling up, right? You have to get to this level before that level. But you also have to know what the ultimate outcome may be. In choice games and branching stories and so on, that's simplified dramatically. I like to say that, a game is not what you see and what you hear, it's what you as the user can do. A choice game, what you can do is fairly limited. This way, that way, maybe there's objects or what have you. And then other, open world games with tremendous capabilities and stories, they're more demanding and they take more time and more commitment, but they're rewarding in a different way. So, I'm glad to hear that choice games are still kicking in the way that they are. Wherever there's a medium, people will figure out how to hack things together that are uniquely taking advantage of that medium. So,
And have you peeked in at all over the past 30 years or so, as kind of the period for commercial interactive fiction in the kind of classic text or text graphics format faded out? There's certainly more
yep.
games than ever being developed and published, less money than ever before, but certainly more more time and effort and actual works making it to the light of day. Have you peeked in at all? Has anything caught your attention?
A bit, but not that much. I'll confess, there's things that I've come across and I've played around with, and the IF comp and the competition, and I've donated to that and played some games in it and so on, or navigated some of the stories. And I'm very admiring of the work. There was Choice of Games. What was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I played around with that for a while, and Twine. But I always tend to fall into the systems level, right? And so, I didn't really make that much, or, and the few games that I did play, or, a fair number of them, were really more around the competition.
Well, and speaking of that systems level, do you still have the original, transfixion, tool chain compiler? Do you have any of your original source or notes from Rendezvous with Rama? Are these things that still exist in the world?
They may exist in the world, but I don't know where they are. When I was in high school, I soldered together a base 10 to base 2 converter with diodes and lights and batteries. And it was like a very primitive computer. And I won first prize in the science fair in high school. And my mother kept it for years and years. And I moved into Manhattan. She lived in Long Island. And I remember once I went out, and she said, "Look, Ron, what I have." And she showed it to me. And I said, "I can't believe it, my first computer." And so I took it home on the Long Island Railroad and I put it in the rack overhead. And I got home and I realized I left it on the train.
Uh,
I'm still in pain about that.
That is a metaphor.
Yes, it is. And actually, as one gets older, one realizes this is the nature of our existence. So what you leave behind should be good.
Because so much of your work did end up being in licensed works, Rendezvous with Rama, Star Trek, and so forth. And I know you were going where the work was, but were there ever kind of pockets of storytelling or particular authors or genres that you felt could have been better exploited, better explored in that period, or that you'd really wanted to take a crack at? The like we said, the selection of what Telarium and Trillium were doing is kind of interesting. Infocom, would dip their toe in a little bit, Hitchhiker's Guide and so forth. We saw fantasy books like the Hobbit, but it was still a fairly small range of properties that were being adapted. Did you see any real
Mhm.
opportunity for authors or genres that either you wanted to crack at or wish somebody else would have taken on?
I've always been a fan of noir thrillers and noir mystery worlds, but to me, that's just sort of a quirk. And there have been a few things like that, but just those kinds of melodramas, I always thought, could use more development. And in fact, on Invention Arts, I'm building an open world called Trouble in North Beach, which is exactly those kinds of characters and all the nefarious doings that they have. So it's more of a genre than a particular property, I think in those terms. And David said something there, I think.
Yeah, he mentioned converting Stephen King novels, which did
Oh
start to
yeah,
happen a little bit later. The Mist got adapted. It seemed like
yeah,
as the industry was evolving and companies were entering even after like Sierra had exited, but then you'd see Mindscape and so forth come in, and they were doing like James Bond, they were doing Stephen King
yeah,
novels. Yeah, it was an interesting
yeah.
time in terms of who was deciding on what.
And I've always been sort of a proponent of creating original properties. This was what the name postlinear was all about. I had a friend named Keith Boski who tragically passed away fairly young. Great guy. And he was an attorney working with the games world. And we used to just jam about this notion of postlinear, because postlinear storytelling, wasn't linear storytelling and it wasn't nonlinear. It was postlinear. It had elements of both, and it could be the basis for creating new properties that could then be expressed in a variety of mediums, which seems obvious now with, The Last of Us and so on. But in the early 90s, it wasn't that obvious. But I saw it happen in comics, and I thought, well, this is a lower cost way to build, relatively then. I mean, when AAA games with, $50 million budgets or anything, but a relatively low cost way of creating something to see if it resonates with an audience. And then you can express that as books and films and so on. Parenthetically, he went on to become president of IDOS and did the Tomb Raider deal to make it a film.
Mm.
Uh, the idea of originating properties has always been far more interesting to me than, Star Trek notwithstanding, than adapting existing properties, because you have the freedom to build something that actually works with the medium you're working in.
Is there anything that you would like to share with the small but growing audience of retro adventure listeners out there that certainly appreciated your work and the work of your peers in the kind of that peak commercial period?
No, other than to say it's very gratifying that people have any interest in this work. And if someone has the desire to evolve from an appreciator to a creator, just go for it. There may be things that you don't know how to do now, but they can be done and you can learn them. And, this is an expressive medium and we want to hear as many voices. It's a, it's one of the ways humans can redeem themselves is by showing the world something that only they can show them.
You've been listening to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. This episode was produced and edited by Jason Compton. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, including Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Podcast Addict. Visit us at retroadventurers.com and follow us on Facebook and Blue Sky. The Retro Adventurers is based on a format originally devised by Ben Collier, Jason Compton, and Dave Hawkins.